Welcome. I'm Doug Morgan, and you're listening to Uncommon Sense, where we hunt for the truth in the topics you're not supposed to talk about, Christianity and politics. What is democracy? It's just a simple question. A democracy is a system of government where supreme power is invested in the people, exercised either directly or through freely elected representatives. That's the dictionary definition of a democracy. We don't have a direct democracy on purpose, really, because our founding fathers knew that a direct democracy doesn't work. I mean, ancient Greece proved that. What happens is that when all the power is in the hands of the people, it just turns into mob rule. And there's no input at all from the minority. What our founding fathers set up was a representative democracy. And this means that the people elect individuals that represent them. Then those representatives have the power to make and enforce laws. This has proven to be a wonderful system. It puts the power in the hands of several elected officials and allows for checks and balances. All we have heard about as of late from our liberal friends is that democracy is under attack and Trump is threatening our democracy. I go on and on. But how is Trump a threat to our democracy? Well, they can't really say. They shout a lot of things like, tax the rich and billionaires are ruining our democracy. In fact, this is straight out of communist Bernie Sanders' website. Listen to this. He says, quote, "It's not just the billionaire ownership and control over the economy and the media that should concern us. The uber rich are also buying our government and undermining American democracy. This is not democracy. This is not one person, one vote." You can just hear him saying it, can't you? That is not what this country is supposed to stand for. In his Gettysburg Address in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln spoke about a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Well, today we have a government of billionaire class, by the billionaire class, for the billionaire class. We are in a pivotal and unprecedented moment in American history. Either we fight to create a government and an economy that works for all, or we continue to move rapidly down the path of oligarchy and the rule of the super rich. The choice is clear. We must stand together for democracy and justice. I mean, that's straight from his website, okay? I know, I threw in the little accent, but we must stand for democracy. We must stand together for democracy, he says. I mean, besides this being a statement just ripped right out of a communist handbook, what is threatening democracy here? But let's just take what useless Bernie is saying, and for the sake of argument, say that he's right. We need to fight against the billionaires of this country to save our democracy. Well, Cameron Arcand writes for the Daily Wire, and Cameron says billionaire and California Democratic gubernatorial candidate Tom Steyer just won the endorsement of Our Revolution. It's a political action group backed by Senator Bernie Sanders, which routinely voices opposition to the existence of billionaires. The group addressed the irony of the endorsement head on, acknowledging Steyer's billionaire status in a press release, adding that, quote, "It matters what he is doing with that power, pushing for taxes on the wealthy, expanding universal programs, and dismantling corporate influence in our politics," unquote. Tom Steyer stands understands that Californians' affordability crisis is not inevitable. It's the result of a political system shaped by concentrated wealth and corporate power at the expense of working people. Our revolution, Executive Director Joseph, I'm going to slaughter this name, Givardisi, I guess. That's what he said. That was his statement. So let's also forget for a moment that California has been run by liberal Democrats for a while now. So if they have any kind of crisis, well, it's their fault, not billionaires. The group's website openly touts efforts to defund oligarchy and its goal to, quote, eliminate in the influence of corporations, billionaires, and consultants in our political process, unquote. Steyer, a climate activist who built his wealth from creating a hedge fund, that hedge fund's called Farallon Capital, has a net worth of $2.4 billion, according to Forbes. He has spent tens of millions dominating the airwaves of the Golden State, and he took similar action when he unsuccessfully sought the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. So let's review, can we? According to Bernie Sanders, billionaires are killing our democracy. Steyer is a multi-billionaire. Bernie is endorsing Steyer. Okay. But it's not just Bernie that wants the opposite of democracy. Yeah, a piece by Daniel D. Martino. He says this past weekend in Barcelona, Spain, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, who, by the way, also thinks he might want to be president, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz took the stage alongside Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, Brazilian President Lula da Silva, Colombian President Gustavo Petro, and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum at a summit their organizers titled, without apparent irony, the Global Progressive Mobilization Forum in defense of democracy. The event was marked as a progressive counterpart to President Donald Trump's Shield of the Americas meeting in Miami last month. In reality, the leftist meeting was a gallery of leaders who have destroyed their very democratic institutions they now claim to champion, and all oppose the interests of the United States. Two elected American Democrats flew across the Atlantic to lend their credibility to that anti-American gallery. They should be asked to explain it, shouldn't they? Start with the host. Pedro Sanchez leads a government engulfed in the worst corruption crisis since Spain's return to democracy. His wife has been formally charged with influence peddling and corruption. His brother is on trial in a separate case because he was given a government job he didn't show up for by socialist officials in his brother's party. His former right-hand man is also on trial over alleged kickbacks on public contracts and prostitution. His attorney general has himself been convicted of leaking confidential information. None of this stops Sanchez from lecturing the world about the dangers of the populist right. But the worst part of Sanchez for America is not his internal destruction of Spain, but that he prohibited the United States from using the two American military bases in the country during the military conflict with Iran. An American senator and a sitting governor saw all of this and decided, it was good to look to support him. Next to Sanchez stood Lula da Silva. Now, Lula was convicted of corruption and money laundering by a Brazilian court in 2017, had his conviction upheld and the sentence increased on appeal in 2018, and served nearly 600 days in prison. Now, his convictions were later annulled on procedural grounds, but he was never acquitted on the merits. He is no doubt guilty, and he returned to the presidency and has spent the last 3 years fast-tracking Brazilians' descent into tyranny with an allied Supreme Court that censors social media and has imprisoned his main political opponent, former President Jair Bolsonaro. But Murphy and Walz pretend to lecture us about democracy. Next up was Gustavo Petro. That's Colombia's president and a former member of the M19, which is a Marxist guerrilla group whose career highlights include the 1985 seizure of Colombia's Palace of Justice, during which 11 Supreme Court justices were killed. Petro aligned his government with former Venezuelan narco tyrant Nicolas Maduro. Testimony from Venezuela's former military intelligence chief, Hugo El Palo Carvala, alleges that Chavez and Maduro financed Petro's presidential campaigns. A U.S. senator sharing a dais with him is not a defense of democracy. It is an act of diplomatic malpractice. And finally, there was Claudia Sheinbaum, who implemented a constitutional overhaul that ended judicial independence in Mexico. In June of 2025, Mexico became the only country on earth to have its population elect all federal judges, including the Supreme Court. Turnout at the constitutional reform was 13%. This is not a democracy. It is a dictatorship of the majority, something the American founders warned us about, remember? Of course, Tim Walz and Chris Murphy must enthusiastically support this because it aligns with their agenda to pack the U.S. Supreme Court, to change the meaning of the Constitution. Perhaps the best part of the Progressive Defense of Democracy meeting in Barcelona last Saturday was that the actual citizens of Latin America didn't care for them. While these wannabe leftist tyrants met in Barcelona, tens of thousands of Venezuelan immigrants were rallying in support of democracy in Spain's capital, Madrid. They were there in support of a transition in Venezuela that is possible thanks to the support of the United States and President Trump's military action to arrest Nicolas Maduro. Truthfully, he says, I would have expected a speech and support for this anti-American meeting from the likes of Representative Alex Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Bernie Sanders, or a video message by the New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani. But I did not expect Murphy and Walz to lend credibility to this meeting of criminals. Murphy is often mentioned in the 2028 presidential as a contender there, and Walz was the Democratic vice presidential nominee. When they stand with these leaders and call it a defense of democracy, they are telling American voters something important about what they believe democracy looks like. So how can you say, I don't get it. How can you say that President Trump is trying to dismantle our democracy when you are supporting communists, dictators, and tyrants? They're openly telling you what they want to do when they take power again. Openly. They're not trying to hide the football here. In fact, from an opinion piece by Chloe Trapanato, she says, it's ironic that after months of hearing how President Donald Trump is a tyrant, a dictator, a fascist, and that his presidency marks the end of the free world as we know it, Democrats would openly discuss upending democratic norms and institutions to consolidate power in their post-Trump new era. James Carville, the political pundit who looks like he wandered out of a Tim Burton film, just screamed the quiet part out loud when he said, if the Democrats win the presidency and both houses of Congress, I think on day one, they should make Puerto Rico and D.C. a state, and they should expand the Supreme Court to 13. F it. Eat our dust. That's what he said on a podcast that was released on Thursday. Don't run on it. Don't talk about it, he said. Just do it. This isn't a new tactic. He's just not hiding it anymore. This is old Clinton advisor. That's what he was, Clinton's top advisor. And this old Clinton advisor is sick of Republicans, the evil villains they are, holding power. So he's telling his colleagues to run as moderates, act like team players, and then, once in office, to radicalize, tear down institutions, seize power, and never relinquish it. That's the play. Game over. When Carville says make D.C. and Puerto Rico states, most people don't realize how loaded this is. The Senate gives every state exactly 2 senators, regardless of the population. That was the Founding Fathers' genius firewall, protecting smaller, rural, and conservative-leaning places from being steamrolled by massive liberal cities, making D.C. a federal district that has voted 90% Democratic since forever, and Puerto Rico, another Democratic-leaning territory, into states instantly hands Democrats 4 automatic new senators and additional House seats, flipping the Senate into a permanent blue bloc. Not earned, just automatic. The Constitution never intended the capital, kept under direct congressional control for a reason, to become a state. And by the way, if either of these jurisdictions leaned right, we would not be having this conversation. Democrats would throw their bodies in front of a speeding freight train to stop Republicans from getting anywhere near that kind of power. With permanent Senate control comes permanent judicial control. The Supreme Court sits at 6-3 conservative right now. And it has done an incredible job protecting Americans' rights on guns, parental authority, and freedom from regulatory overreach. Once those justices retire, a Democrat-controlled Senate would never confirm another conservative. Americans would be at the mercy of Ketanji Brown Jackson and company, which is more terrifying than Kamala Harris with a microphone after a glass of rosé. I love that. That conservative court has blocked radical progressive overreach time after time. It saved the Second Amendment, protected vulnerable children, struck down unconstitutional mandates, and kept the administrative state from running wild. Hand Democrats a 7-2 or an 8-1 liberal majority, and every one of those protections evaporates overnight. Nationwide abortion on demand, gun confiscation, open borders codified into law, and a federal government free to regulate every inch of your life. Everything would go to hell in a handbasket, and there would be no off-ramps. Statehood isn't even the whole play. Democrats in Virginia, Illinois, Maryland, New York, and California are already redistricting, packing Republican voters into a handful of super safe GOP districts while slicing conservative neighborhoods thin across Democratic ones. This is creating maps that look drawn by a blind drunk cartoonist. This guarantees they'll lock down the House too, no matter how many votes conservatives actually win nationwide. Carville's strategy is to run moderate, govern radically, and don't tip your hand until it's done. The gerrymandering, already underway, proves they aren't waiting around. They're not stopping at redistricting either. As Matthew Hennessy laid out in the Wall Street Journal piece, Democrats are already leaking decade-old Supreme Court memos to the New York Times and spinning conservative justice as sneaky, petty, planet-hating partisans, deliberately ruining public trust in the current 63 court so that Americans will be more willing to throw court packing when the time comes. Well, James Carville can keep, crackling, "F it, eat our dust," like some bald-headed villain, but this isn't a bold Democratic power play. It's a naked confession that they've lost faith in actually winning over the American people. Stack the Senate with automatic blue seats, pack the court to erase its conservative firewall, redraw House maps until they look like abstract art, and saddle taxpayers with billions in new debt and welfare costs that bankrupt Puerto Rico can't handle even now. And suddenly the threat to democracy they screamed about for 8 straight years becomes their permanent business model. James Madison saw this coming in Federalist 47. President Ronald Reagan warned us about it every day of his public life. When one party has to rig the rules, the districts, the judiciary, just to stay in charge, they don't believe in safe and self-government anymore. They believe in ruling forever. The same people who called Donald Trump a fascist dictator are now openly engineering the Constitution off-ramp that would make actual tyranny look subtle. So no, we won't eat your dust. We see the game. We see how close we are to the edge. This time, the good guys aren't going to sit on the sidelines while evil walks through the front door wearing a smile and calling it progress. Get off X, get off the couch, and fight at every ballot box, school board, and state house, because freedom really is one generation from extinction. And the generation that lets Carville and his crew shatter these last firewalls will be the one that hands their kids a republic in name only. Game over for them, if we decide it is. And I'll say, so don't let me don't tell me that Trump is a threat to democracy. You don't dismantle what we have as a democracy, and and then what the political party is promising to do right now. They're promising to dismantle our democracy. You don't do that and then turn around and say that, oh, no, the other guy's doing it. This isn't new for them. They have been on this for a while. In fact, here's an opinion piece that was in The Hill, okay? Not a conservative publication whatsoever, but it was put together by John Opskik and Jerry Gruber from right after the presidential election in November of 2024, okay? So it goes back to that time period. And it says this. It says, Vice President Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party tried to convince Americans that democracy was on the ballot last week. Their appeals largely fell on deaf ears. The conclusion most analysts take from this is that Americans don't care about progress. They only care about the narrow self-interest and bread and butter issues. We disagree. It's more accurate and honest to point out that the Democratic Party has no credibility when it comes to democracy and progress. Consider They shielded Joe Biden from scrutiny over his mental acuity for months, and then ignored Representative Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson, who said shielding Joe Biden will be a disaster. They scrapped all primary debates. The Florida Democratic Party canceled its primary altogether in order to keep Phillips from competing. The Wisconsin Democratic Party tried a similar tactic, only to be forced by the courts to change course. The Democratic National Committee created a war room, as they called it, to discredit and derail Robert Kennedy Jr.'s primary challenge. And in the end, they succeeded in driving him out of the party. Meanwhile, in states from Colorado to Michigan, Democratic politicians and lawyers sought to bar Trump from ballots under a novel theory that the 14th Amendment prevented him from running for office because of his aid and comfort to the insurrection or rebellion. Once Operation Bubble Wrap could no longer be sustained to protect the fragile Biden, they cast him aside, pivoted, and anointed Harris, having dropped out of the 2020 primary before a single vote was cast because her polling was so bad. Harris had the distinction of never having received a single vote for president. All this in the name of saving democracy. The Democratic Party's hostility toward open progress was not limited to the presidential race either. They actively campaigned against ballot referenda in Arizona, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Nevada, and South Dakota. That would have reformed the system and given independent voters the right to participate in primary elections and given all voters the right to choose from among all the candidates. And 2024 was not an aberration. The Democratic Party has for years championed efforts to defeat primary election reform across the country. In states where voters overcame their obstructionism, like California and Washington, they advocate for a return to an exclusionary system. This is not a Democrats bad, Republican good matter. Ever since primary elections became commonly used in the 1960s, both the Democratic and Republican parties have elected and relegated to our primary elections as theirs to do with as they wish. They mandate them and use them to divide and obstruct and exclude. They abide by them when it serves their purpose, then reject them when it doesn't. That may serve the purpose of some party leaders and special interests, but it isn't serving the American people. But it is a bigger problem for the Democratic Party because they claim to be the party concerned with the democratic rights and ordinary Americans. They must face the hypocrisy of wrapping themselves in the mythology of defending democracy while engaged in such a widespread form of voter suppression. Leaders like Nancy Pelosi are now publicly lamenting the lack of open process because they lost the election. But they have yet to examine the depths of their opposition to sharing power with regular people. The way we conduct primary elections in our country is outdated, exclusionary, and leads to a Congress and state legislatures that represent smaller and smaller bands of partisans, not the broad electorate. 51% of Americans now identify as independents. Their voting rights mean nothing to the leaders of either party. But they mean a hell of a lot to an increasing number of Americans across the political spectrum. Don't be fooled. Americans are deeply about democracy and about process, but they won't be lectured by hypocrites. Let's hope the Democratic Party takes a good long look at its credibility on democracy, and as Democrats process the results of this election, plot a path forward. So again, I ask, who is a threat to our democracy? I would love to hear your answer to it. And you can always do that at uncommonsensepodcast.com. Thank you very much for listening. This podcast is a production of Morganite Communications.